Welcome to the latest on rising food prices, lessons from across the food supply chain. Please welcome Darren Baxt, Senior Research Fellow for Environmental Policy and Regulation at the Heritage Foundation.
Good afternoon. My name is Darren Baxt, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow, Environmental Policy and Regulation in the Heritage Foundation Center for Energy, Climate, and Environment. I want to thank you for joining us today as we discuss the latest in food prices and learn what's really going on across the food supply chain. Food prices in May were a whopping 10.1% greater than prices in May 2021. Over the past 9 months, each month's year-over-year food price increase has been above 4%, with each successive month higher than the previous month. So starting at 4.6% in September and reaching 10.1% in May. These food price increases, which haven't been seen in over 40 years, are occurring across all food categories, from fresh fruits to fish and seafood. This data can make the situation sound so academic and impersonal. But make no mistake, these skyrocketing food prices are devastating for Americans and their families. We all know this because it's impacting each one of us in one way or another. Today, I'm honored to be joined by leading experts across the food supply chain. Mark Dopp is Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel at the North American Meat Institute. Jennifer Hatcher is Chief Public Policy Officer and Senior Vice President of Government Relations at FMI, the Food Industry Association. And we're joined by Tom Jarecki, who's Vice President, Supply Chain and Logistics at the Consumer Brands Association. So we'll have a conversation today that I hope helps dispel myths, lays out key facts, and identifies specific problems and solutions. So let's get right to it. And let's start with a quick overview question for each of you. Let's start with you, Jennifer. Jennifer, what do you think is contributing to higher food prices?
Darren, I think the broader question is what is not contributing to higher prices? And certainly the prices throughout society are contributing, but elevated specifically in our world, certainly there are the labor shortage, energy costs, transportation costs, supply chain bottlenecks, and then ingredient challenges on the food front. The other maybe shorter term components would include weather disruptions, recalls, and honestly, both shorter and longer term credit card fees. So just a host of different factors.
Some things I didn't even think of, actually, that. So, Mark, what's your take? What's going on?
Well, I guess I'll start by agreeing with almost everything that Jennifer said. She had quite a laundry list there. The war obviously is contributing to this, almost everything. But if I can focus on the meat industry for just a moment, something that people tend to forget about is higher prices. In our case, the higher prices we're seeing is a function of record-setting demand for meat. With the sort of the beginning of the pandemic, the prices for meat products, poultry products have gone up fairly dramatically, although they are starting to drop a little bit on the meat side. But we are seeing, if you ask any reputable agricultural economist, we are seeing record-setting demand. And even though the supply has rebounded from the lower, the problems that beset us early in the coronavirus pandemic, many of those issues have been addressed. But the record-setting demand has not diminished. And if there is, great demand for a product, then even with a regular amount of supply, you're still going to see higher prices. So, I'll add demand to the laundry list that Jennifer's already thrown out there.
I'm glad you brought that up. We're gonna delve into supply and demand a little later on. So, Tom, let me turn to you. What do you think about what's contributing to higher food prices?
And I'm not going to say anything shocking to what Jennifer and Mark just overviewed, but I'm going to add some specific numbers to some of those things that they just walked us through. So when you think about these rising costs, right, the CPG industry alone is short 142,000 jobs, putting like sort of a finer point on that labor question. We continue to see some of those supply chain bottlenecks cause and contribute to these rising costs. You have wholesale costs up nearly 11% overall. If you look across PPI, it's 12.6% just for food manufacturing. But if you really drill down into some of the important commodities, you see tremendous spikes, whether looking at this line or when you look at like eggs, wheat. There's so many factors that are just like prevalent ingredients, let's say, that are significantly contributing to those cost increases. And that isn't then unpacking, further issues around energy, demand, as Mark said. So our industry continues to see record-breaking demand. It's up 6% year over year. And that's to 2021, of course, which is still up year over year, even from the early panic buying during the pandemic. So we've seen 9 straight months of demand eclipse even what was like record-breaking, clear-the-shelf panic buying. And so I think that's the sort of maybe color commentary to the demand question that you continue to see. So it's all of those factors, and it's the perfect storm of events.
So that's a good way to start, and I'd like to kind of delve into these issues. And one issue area I like to get into first is energy costs. So Jennifer, from the perspective of grocery stores and all of your members, are energy costs having an impact on food prices that we're seeing on the shelves?
Darren, huge impacts. I mean, certainly on the transportation front, the number of trucks that are necessary to transport products to stores and to distribution centers and between suppliers, that's that diesel price is very important. And certainly also the impact is not only just on our side of things, but looking back to the cost of feed and fertilizer and the other component products and how those energy costs impact each of those. Certainly agriculture and food production, in addition to that, the transportation side of things are all energy intensive. And so changes to the price of oil and energy have huge ripple effects throughout the whole food supply chain.
So Jennifer, if I could follow up, I'm glad that you brought up transportation costs, because I think it's important that there's a recognition that issues in one area, like in grocery stores or trucking, can impact other areas. And can you kind of elaborate a little bit on the interconnected nature of this food supply chain and just how important that is when we're talking about food costs?
Absolutely, and trucking is probably a perfect example when you think about, the items on trucks. You have to have those trucks, and sometimes it may be that if we have extra trucks capacity in our fleet, we may go to a manufacturing facility to pick up product, and then you think about the needs of trucks and how those are also important with the challenges at ports and at rails in predictability. You can't, if you don't know when an item is going to come into port or when it's going to be ready at the rail yard, you don't know when to send that truck to pick up the extra item. So communication between all of these sectors, I know certainly during COVID, each of the three of us had at least weekly communication. In most cases, it was more often daily communication. But just that interconnected nature of the supply chain, all the way, honestly, from seed all the way to fork is so important.
That's great. So, Tom, getting back to energy costs, how are rising energy costs impacting food manufacturers?
I mean, think about every aspect of the food manufacturing supply chain, whether it's getting a product from point A to point B on a truck, or even just keeping the lights on. When energy costs go up, all costs tend to go up too, and so it's all it is all connected. Mark, to your point, I'm going to add a little bit to what Jennifer was saying on the trucking side of things too. That when you really look at not only the rising cost of fuel, but we were already in a predicament when it came to transportation capacity in this country. We're 85,000 drivers short. At any given moment in time, you're talking about 30% of trucks on the road are either empty or significantly underutilized. And so there's a real issue when it comes to finding the capacity to move products. So that just it continues to, I think, sort of, you have those rising costs. It's even harder to sort of mitigate that and control those costs as a manufacturer or retailer, anyone in between. These are all drawing from that same pool of available capacity as well.
So, we've been bringing up trucking a lot, and I would think that one big aspect, obviously, of the trucking issue, high energy costs, are the high diesel prices. So, June 3rd, 2022, the last time PIA released some data, the diesel prices were $5 per gallon. What's your take on that? What you're hearing about that?
Mark, you broke in and out a little bit there.
Yeah, this is Darren.
Darren, your question was on diesel, the impact of diesel increases?
Yeah, diesel prices on truckers right now. Anyway, Tom, did you hear that?
At least from our perspective, it's an extraordinary impact. But the cost of the labor cost and the availability, but also the diesel price increases absolutely are impacting each of those sectors. I'm sure Tom and Mark are seeing that as well.
Right. Well, and every one of us on this call has companies that run a business, truckers included, who are running a business, and they have to ensure that their bottom line is preserved. And so if their costs are rising, then those are certainly going to be shared across the supply chain. That's not a surprise to anyone. I also think that you see a number of our manufacturers operate and run their own fleet, and so as their costs increase, the cost to serve rises higher too. So I don't think it's particularly surprising that when you see diesel costs increase, that other costs increase all along that value chain, and that's compounded many times over, right? So the transportation of grain then costs more, which is the transportation then of our products to the retail store, which is the retail distribution center to the retail store. It's that cost is baked in multiple times, sort of over the journeys throughout the supply chain.
Mark, did you want to add anything at all to the energy costs? There's a lot covered there.
Tom and Jennifer pretty much covered everything. I mean, we don't represent producers directly. I mean, we have some members of ours who raise livestock, hogs in particular, and they'll tell you, if you're in the livestock production business, they'll tell you the three biggest inputs are feed, fuel, and fertilizer, and they've already been mentioned. And running a meat packing plant is no different than running a lot of other food production operations. I mean, we've got chillers, we've got coolers, we've got energy to run the facilities, we've got fleets of trucks, or we're hiring a fleet of trucks to deliver the product to Jennifer's members, for example. So, it's really, I don't have much to add. It's no different than most of the others, and everybody's seeing an across the board increase. It's that simple. When that's going to abate, that's the more interesting question. If I knew that, I probably wouldn't be talking to you, Darren.
Well, I need you to talk to me some more now, because I'm going to turn to you again. And
okay, fair enough.
Let's switch to labor shortage and labor costs. So, Mark, the meat and poultry industry have had significant labor challenges. Can you explain some of these challenges, even the challenges that you had before the pandemic?
Well, yes. So let's start with the fact that the labor issues, the shortage is the issue that when the CEOs of my member companies come talk to us, and we've got an executive board meeting next week, for example, labor is on the agenda. But we've had labor challenges, as you pointed out, well before the pandemic started. I mean, the pandemic simply exacerbated those challenges. I guess it's not terribly surprising if you think about it, where slaughterhouses in particular and processing operations are located. Oftentimes they're in rural America, where there's not the largest labor pool available. They may be the largest employer in the city or in the town or the county. Oftentimes that's the case. So you don't have the largest labor pool out there. There have been some of the restrictions in terms of immigration and everything else. We would love to see some sort of immigration reform take place. Do I think that's going to happen? No, but I defer to experts like Jennifer when it comes to issues like that. But I mean, the fact of the matter also is working in a meat packing plant is hard work. I mean, it's a difficult work environment, and encouraging people, or providing an incentive for people to take some of those jobs sometimes is a huge challenge. So we've had to adjust. And it's not a secret that the meat industry was sort of the bloody tip of the spear in terms of a perspective during the early days of the pandemic. I mean, we were able to overcome that successfully once we were able to implement the programs and practices that the CDC, recommended it. But what the companies have been forced to do is adjust, and they've adjusted in several ways. For example, the average wage for hourly wage now in a meatpacking plant is somewhere around $22 an hour. Companies have simply been forced to pay more. That was several dollars an hour below that before COVID hit. So paying more is something that's been has occurred. It's not a secret. A number of companies have announced some very creative community projects. Would be that in some cases building housing for employees. In other cases, some companies are providing community college education free to the members and employees' families. These types of programs and projects are being investigated by meatpacking companies all the time, and they've been pretty successful. And I guess the third point I'd make when it comes to labor is the labor shortage, which continues, prompts looking more and more at how do we do things without using as many people. Is there automation? Are there robotics out there? Some things simply have to be done by people. But are there some tasks that can be performed through mechanization or automation, robotics, call it whatever you want, that makes it less necessary to have, maybe we just need fewer people if we could step in with machinery to do the job that used to be done by people. So those are the three things I think that we have to recognize that come out of the pandemic. And again, it's not just the pandemic, it was the shortage before COVID hit. So.
Thanks, Mark. So Jennifer, when I think of labor shortage challenges in the food supply chain, at least me, I often think about the problems at the retail level. Am I right to think that there have been some serious problems? And can you provide some examples?
Well, and probably the reason you think about the retail level is we are often everyone's first job, and many people's part-time job and retirement job as well. And so the average supermarket has more than 100 employees. We're very labor intensive just to run a store. And many of our stores have many more than that. And there were just a number of factors that have really put challenges on food retail during the pandemic. And that one would be just when schools closed. Many parents then could not work. They had to choose between staying home with their children and coming to work, or in other cases, we had students who, had been part of that our after-school part-time environment, and ultimately we were able to pick some of those folks back up. But it's just the labor piece of it. Our members reported in that first year of COVID, they spent more than $24 billion just on pandemic-related expenses, half of that going to employees in salaries and incentives. Mark mentioned several of those pieces. But it's a big pain point, and it's a constant battle to attract enough talent, but also to retain them. As Mark said, some of these jobs are they're really important jobs, and but some of them are demanding. I mean, I know in our warehouses, it takes a special kind of person to be able to work successfully in a warehouse and make sure that all the rest of us have the kinds of products that we need.
So I want to talk about supply and demand, and Mark, you had already talked about it. So, I think one of the key issues that's going on here is simple economics. In other words, basic supply and demand. There are significant shifts in supply and demand during the peak of the pandemic, as was brought up. So I guess my question is, what's going on now, and how's it impacting food prices? Tom, let me turn to you on that question.
Yeah, and I'll sort of situate the conversation a little bit in the context of labor too. And so when you think about, I mentioned the number 142,000 open positions across the CPG manufacturing landscape alone. companies, are trying to pull out all of the stops to fill that delta. So salaries are up 6.5%, which exceeds sort of like other industry marks. They're becoming more flexible in terms of the scheduling arrangements and trying to work around folks' calendars and sort of adapt to the changing workplace as it relates to, which is especially, I think, difficult in a manufacturing setting, right? When you're trying to run, frankly, 24/7 in a lot of cases, or sort of now multiple shifts over the weekend, and you're needing to pivot to account for the flexibilities that are so in demand by employees. And so you're trying to meet them where they're at, to fill positions at a time when there's also, frankly, very, very low unemployment in this country. So there's only so many people, and as Mark said, many facilities are often in rural areas, or often in more challenging areas to hire in. For historic reasons, for proximity to agriculture, a whole host of reasons that go into that. But at the end of the day, it becomes hard to find and retain good talent, that issue is one that you can only address through sort of like a multifaceted approach. So immigration, to Mark's point, has to be on the table. You also have to think about what are the jobs training and skills and education programs needed in the future to ensure that we have the right mix of talent going forward as a country. That's a big conversation. It's not one that probably Mark, Jennifer, or I are going to like single-handedly unpack on today's call or any time in the future. But I think that it's time for that conversation as a country to think about, well, what is that supply-demand equation that you need on a labor front to really ensure the resiliency and the stability of supply chains, and especially ones as critical as food, to ensure that people have access and to affordable and available products every time they go to the store.
Thanks, Tom. So Jennifer, I'd like to get back to you. I'd like to get your take on this question. As I imagine, I'm pretty aware that your members are seeing firsthand what's going on with supply and demand, all these different shifts and like supply and for the pandemic and after. Just tell us what's going on.
No, absolutely, and Tom hit on some key points there. But and the other things that I think I would throw out is just on the ingredient side, certainly constantly battling challenges with ingredients, and also on the packaging end. That's one of the things that really hit us hardest during COVID was not just the product itself, but finding the appropriate packaging for the product or a material in the packaging. And so that's one of those things that has and continues to impact supply. But the other part of it is the consumers themselves, and you can kind of get on that gerbil wheel of if you cannot maintain the consumer confidence, then you may get back to a difficult time. Our customers need to know that they're going to have the products available that they need when they need them, or otherwise, if they modify their buying patterns, then that could also impact that supply and demand piece. I know for many of us, we changed, potentially even where we work physically. I'm in the office today, but that's not the case every day. I may be working from my home office or from another location now that we have all this Zoom features and Teams features on the technology front. But that impacts where you may eat lunch, or all of the other factors, or even where you may eat dinner, or where your kids may be eating in terms of the food supply. And so part of it is the physical movement, location, and making sure we have the right products at the right place at the right time. But again, that consumer demand piece and the consumer confidence piece is an important factor in this, and that we want to make sure that folks have what they need, but don't feel like they need to take extraordinary efforts to stock up in times where there is less availability.
So I'd like to turn to some of the myths that are connected to each of your industries as it relates to high food prices. And I'm going to bring some up, but feel free to add any additional myths that I missed. So Mark, I'd like to start with you on this, because in my opinion, the meat industry is being unfairly criticized through misleading and inaccurate information. So, like for example, Mark, is there increased consolidation in the meat packing industry, and what would you say to critics who try to assert that the industry is acting in an anti-competitive manner?
Well, first, let me agree with you that we're being unfairly criticized, so we'll start there, okay? In terms of the myths, okay, if I may say this again later, but if the folks watching this webinar today don't come away with anything else I say today, there is a myth that is being perpetuated by plenty of people, particularly up on Capitol Hill and even in the White House, and that is that there's increasing consolidation in the meat industry. That is simply fundamentally not true. In the fed beef sector in particular, there's what we call the 4-firm concentration ratio. I'm a little bit familiar with this. I worked on some of these mergers back in the late 80s. I like to say that I'm a food and drug lawyer and a recovering antitrust lawyer, so I know just enough about this stuff to be dangerous probably. But the 4-firm concentration ratio for the fed cattle industry, and that's the fed cattle will really provide your basic, your steaks and your roasts and that sort of thing, not really so much on the ground beef side. That ratio, that 4-firm ratio, has not changed meaningfully since about 1990. It has toggled right around 82, 83, 84%, and admittedly, that is a relatively high number, but it is no different than the 4-firm ratios in a lot of other sectors in the economy. So people who say that the meat industry is increasingly consolidated are ignoring the facts, and those aren't my numbers. Those are USDA data. That's USDA data that I'm citing. So that is a myth that needs to be dispelled. And then the second thing I'll say about in response to the comment about, or the question about anti-competitive behavior. Listen, I have a stack of studies about this high in my office. The meat poultry industry has probably been investigated, studied, analyzed more than just about any other out there. We're the most heavily regulated industry other than nuclear energy, and we've been studied and investigated to death. And every time that somebody does a study, they come back and they say it's a very competitive industry, and I will attest to that. The USDA conducted an analysis or conducted an investigation in the wake of the Holcomb fire and then sort of spilling into the early months of COVID. And the report there said there's nothing to see here. It's a competitive industry. So I'm going to reject just categorically the assertions made by those who believe that somehow, some way, the meat poultry industry is not competitive, or at least the meat industry.
So, Mark, one of the arguments I make is that the concentration level has been relatively the same since 1990, which it has been, as you said. It's kind of hard to blame current high food prices on the concentration level, unless I'm missing something, unless it magically took 30 years for it to kick in.
Darren, if you listen to some people, we've been hanging around for 30 years waiting to pounce. That doesn't really make any sense to me. So, I mean, and frankly, if you look at one thing I should have mentioned, if you look at there's in our business, in the cattle side in particular, the beef business, there's something called the cattle cycle. And this kind of goes back to the supply and demand issue that we were discussing before. So right now, we are about to enter a phase in which the herd is shrinking. And it's shrinking for a variety of reasons. In 2014 and 2015, for example, the herd was at its the cow herd was at its smallest level since the Truman administration. And the producers, the cow-calf producers in particular, were making record profits while the packers were hemorrhaging money. Well, the cattle cycle, which is about an 8 to 10 year window, depending on the circumstances, it's a cycle. And in the last couple of 3 years, the packers have been making more money, and the producers have either been making not much, or in some cases at the feedlot level, maybe even losing money. But that's the cyclical nature of the cattle business. And what we're seeing right now is the cow herd is beginning to shrink. Again, for a variety of reasons. There are more young cattle, female cattle going to feedlots to be processed and harvested. And that means fewer cows, which in turn means fewer calves, which means ultimately fewer cattle to be supplied to the system, right? We're going to continue to see that. And like I said, Other factors are contributing to that. There's a severe drought in certain parts of the country. Producers are simply sending more of their animals to the feedlot and ultimately to the harvest facility because they can't afford to feed them because of the weather. So all of these factors are part of the supply and demand we talked about, as well as the myths versus the realities.
So Mark, I'm not picking on you. Tom and Jennifer, I don't want to get jealous. I'm going to ask Mark another question. But Mark, one of the concerns I have, and this actually applies to Tom and Jennifer as well, is that the myths that we're going to talk about can influence legislation and proposed regulations. Just briefly, is there any legislation that's kind of being proposed, regulations that's being proposed that are kind of buying into these myths?
Yes, unfortunately there are. And let me focus on one right now, and maybe we'll talk about the other one a little later. We talk about government intervention. But there is a bill that is moving its way through the House of Representatives and its companion moving through the Senate. And it's basically referencing it's what I call the Office of Special Investigator. Somehow, some way, some of the folks up in Congress have decided that if the Congress creates an Office of Special Investigator at the Department of Agriculture, that will magically make food prices go down. Now, USDA, in particular the Packers and Stockyards Division of the Agricultural Marketing Service, is charged with enforcing the Packers and Stockyards Act. And for the folks on the call who aren't familiar with the Packers and Stockyards Act, it's our special little niche law that affects the meat and poultry industry specifically, and it is basically there to address unfair practices and undue preferences in the meat and poultry industry with respect to how packers treat producers. Now, there is a division at USDA, like I said, the P&S division in the Ag Marketing Service, that is charged with enforcing that law. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, or at least some in Congress in their infinite wisdom, have decided that they need to create an Office of the Special Investigator, which would wait for it, enforce the Packers and Stockyards Division. So you have to wonder a little bit what the purpose is of this wholly redundant office that would, again, rest within the confines of the Department of Agriculture, to the tune of somewhere between $5 and $9 million to make it work, depending on who you listen to. You have to wonder a little bit about how that is. One, is it necessary? And two, how does creating this office contribute to reducing inflation and lowering food prices? And oh, by the way, they're attempting to do this at a time when USDA has announced that it is going to propose some new regulations that would directly conflict with the holdings of how the Packers and Stockyards Act should be enforced and implemented, in conflict with the holdings of 8 separate federal appellate courts. So I'm kind of scratching my head about how creating this office and having them go forward is going to do anything to lower the price of food. If somebody can explain that to me, I'm happy to have that conversation.
Thanks, Mark. Jennifer, I want to switch to you to talk about myths. And, the myths that I hear surrounding grocery stores, at least what I'm hearing, revolve around claims that stores are unfairly and unreasonably passing on the costs to customers. So how will you respond to that?
Darren, that's a great question. And our profit margin on the food retail side has always been 1% to 3%. We keep that every year, and it's never hit that top end of that margin. So I think we're trying everything to keep prices as low as possible during all these extraordinary inflationary pressures. So I think Mark hit on one of the components too, is that there has been an increase in just the number of customers that are eating at home or eating in different environments, and the volume has increased, but certainly the margin remains extremely narrow. And the different cost structures or cost pieces that have been added on during the pandemic have really just caused huge impact as well. So for one thing, I know credit card fees, that's something almost everyone moved to the use of credit cards because of the pandemic, and that's driven up that particular factor is now the second leading cost that many on the retail side are facing, and certainly combined with all of those other pieces there. But I would say the margin has remained the same, and it's just the pressures on the other end that are really adding to it.
Tom, are there any myths that you'd like to add? Do you think that might be exist out there?
And I think with all due respect to Mark's members and Jennifer's members, I would probably argue that our membership constitutes some of the most recognizable brands in America, right? That are the names that you recognize at a grocery store aisle. It's ultimately probably an easy place to lay blame if you're a consumer, right? You're like, well, why does the soda cost more? Like, what's the soda manufacturer's fault? Or why does the cereal cost more? What's the cereal manufacturer's fault? And it's just simply not true. We are all in this inflationary environment together. We're all subject to those same price and cost increases, the lack of transportation, the supply chain bottlenecks we've already sort of like run through, and not getting into like the labor side or the energy side that many consumers don't see at all, because there's sort of like this, there's an aspect of like taking the supply chain for granted at times, I think, that still persists even as it's risen to the fore throughout the pandemic. But it's easy to, I think, blame a brand rather than the circumstances that those brands find themselves in. And I think that what we've continued to try to do throughout the pandemic, and then sort of in this post-ish pandemic phase, as we see rising inflation, is to call attention to the real problems and try to develop policy solutions that really target those and sort of zero in on how to fix those as the issue, rather than just pointing fingers at private enterprise.
So kind of related, but let's switch gears a bit and look at how existing government intervention could be driving up food prices. So Tom, I'll come right back to you. So if you had a magic wand to get rid of some harmful government interventions related to food prices and driving up food prices, what would you try to get rid of?
Let's start with transportation. It's just like an easy example, right? Like the ability for us to move more product hasn't changed significantly in years. And so if you could just run a heavier, just as safe truck, you could make that system work a lot more efficiently. If you are able to think through what are the regulations, the difficulties in terms of opening a new plant or establishing a facility or getting a new product online, when companies innovate and develop that product and bring that product to market, that process could be drastically simplified. You look at, I think, not to pick on FDA, I think we're working through a lot of things right now, but there's been a lot of press and media around some of how FDA has been handling issues over time. And certainly I think that when it comes to like getting a house in order, or just sort of like having a clear management structure and the ability to really have oversight over the food system, that there could be some opportunities to really foster a more collaborative relationship with the business community, and also one that aligns really to like clear vision and goals, and then ultimately execution. And then, just thinking about other aspects, thinking about that supply demand conversation that we just had, as the cost, let's say, of various edible oils has increased or become entirely unavailable in some cases, like sunflower oil because of the war in Ukraine. Manufacturers having the ability and the flexibility to adapt to those environments is critical. So if and there's some COVID-related temporary flexibilities that are in place, but thinking long term, if there's a process to establishing really clear opportunities for labeling flexibility, the ability to sort of swap in and out very similar sort of non-differential ingredients into a product just to account for those supply demand fluctuations and the availability concerns, that's ultimately going to really protect consumers from some of those cost increases and ensure that product is on the shelf, because it's giving the manufacturers the flexibility to account for those, whether it's drought or seasonal variation or a product or war in Ukraine, whatever the case is, right? You see these events, these disruptions, and we have to react to those. So that flexibility would go a long way.
That's a great list, Tom. So Mark, I see a lot of misguided intervention in the meat industry. So, real quickly, what do you think is some intervention that should be addressed?
Oh, I could probably pick at a few nits on the, at USDA. I think they do a pretty good job. From my perspective, some of the ideas that have been floated out there that I would argue might lessen the food safety approach. From my perspective, food safety is non-negotiable, and anything that's suggested that might adversely affect that, we shouldn't be talking about. But let me comment on a government intervention that is about as egregious as I can think of that could be coming down the road, and that is there is a bill in the Senate sponsored by Senators Grassley and Fisher in particular that would move to require packers to purchase some specific percentage of their cattle in the open cash market. What's evolved over the past 20 to 25 years is we moved from about 50% cash sales in fed cattle to now it's about 20%. And the reason we've done that is the producers came to the packers and said, if we provide you with livestock, with cattle that have certain characteristics or attributes, be it hormone-free, never ever, whatever the case may be, and invest in genetics, for example, to improve the quality, such that we now have something north of 80% of the beef in this country either grades at prime or choice, and that wasn't the case 20 to 25 years ago because that's what the customers who frequent Jennifer's member stores are looking for. So what we have is the development of these things called alternative marketing arrangements. Well, Senator Grassley doesn't like alternative marketing arrangements and wants to reduce their use. But they've contributed significantly to the quality of the product, increasing the demand for beef. But this bill would regress us back to where we were 25 years ago. If this becomes law, you're taking the decision about how cattle producers want to market their cattle out of their hands and putting it in the hands of USDA. And USDA is going to say, if you live in this particular region, Packer X, you have to buy 40 or 50% of your cattle on the live market, when their suppliers may not want to do that. And the end result is going to be a decrease in quality, an increase in price. And I'm not familiar with, I'm an ag economist by training and an attorney, but if anybody can identify another sector of the economy where the government is telling somebody, thou shalt buy some percentage of your products in this particular fashion, I'm not aware of it.
And of course, the whole concept of freedom to contract seems to be kind of being trampled on. So Jennifer, what are some government interventions in your industry? I mean, we've talked a lot about energy and labor, and what are some policies you think can be addressed?
Yeah, I would jump onto two areas that Tom mentioned and just tag on there. One on regulatory flexibility. We were able to get some regulatory flexibility during COVID, and some of that I think should be extended. Tom mentioned the ingredient substitution piece, and I would also mention some of the substitutions that and different policies with regard to WIC, which is the program for babies up to age 5. Women, infant, and children is what WIC stands for. But on size of packaging, I know, for instance, one of the items that's on that WIC program often is peanut butter. And during the pandemic, when certain manufacturers were reducing the number of runs of peanut butter, they wanted to put it all in 16-ounce jars of peanut butter rather than a 32-ounce jar, or having the multiple sizes. So in the WIC program, allowing those kinds of substitutions on sizes, that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you have both on the manufacturing and retail side to be able to provide product during some of those supply chain challenging situations, it's very helpful. And the other thing is some of the flexibilities, again, more in the WIC program on not having in-person interviews, being able to have interviews related to participation in the program via technologies like we're using right now to cut down on some of the extra time and expense associated with some of those interactions. So I would say regulatory flexibilities, and there are a host of them that happened during the pandemic that we feel like should continue to stay in place. Second, again, on the transportation front, Tom mentioned truck sizes and weights, but I would also say the young driver pilots, and several of us know that as the Drive Safe Act. And if John was with us, I know he would jump on that as well. But we want to encourage young people as they graduate from high school to enter that trucking profession, and getting that pilot up and running and ultimately getting it broader, we think would be a real contribution towards that. And then the third category I would add in there is on the tariff front. One of the things that we have been spending a tremendous amount of time on is the infant formula shortage and crisis. And what we found is importing infant formula from overseas, in many cases, you're paying a double-digit tariff on that product coming in. So I would say, to review any tariffs on products that Americans cannot source from, domestically. So if we're looking at some of those and we want that product imported, then we should review those tariffs associated with it. So those would be my three categories: regulatory flexibilities, again, deep dive on transportation and some of the opportunities there, and then tariffs.
That's great. And I feel like we've kind of gotten into a lot of the solutions. So as we wrap up, I'm going to ask you just to provide a few key takeaways that you think viewers should take with them about current food prices, and feel free to add any solutions that you think that you weren't able to get to. So regarding, addressing higher food prices. So Tom, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think that the big takeaway should be one that, of course, it's a multitude of issues that are contributing to these rising costs, but it all is stuff that's happening around the supply chain. And so we really can't let our foot off the gas when it comes to addressing supply chain issues, both in the short and the long term. And again, from like a short-term standpoint, I think we did a great job of walking through some of the flexibilities that might be accounted for, some of the regulatory changes that might happen immediately and have that immediate benefit. You also just saw the passage of things like the Ocean Shipping Reform Act and other sort of tools that are potentially going to I think improve some of the situation on the maritime shipping front. You have rail issues that are a real challenge right now in addition to the trucking side. But when it comes to just that big long-term picture, there has to be real strategic focus on supply chains going forward at a policy-making level. And we see opportunities to do that through China competitiveness legislation, whether that's at the Department of Commerce or elsewhere, but really being able to zero in and drive investment in domestic manufacturing going forward is critical to ensuring supply chain resilience and ultimately the availability and affordability of the products that are on the shelf for consumers.
Thanks, Mark. Tom. Mark, what are some key takeaways and any solutions we may have missed?
My solution is fairly straightforward, and that is just when it comes to the markets and the supply chain and everything else, less government intervention is probably more, is better. Let the forces of supply and demand work. For example, the meat industry is incredibly complex. People may not appreciate this, but an animal, for example, can be sold as many as 6 times from the time it's born to the time it goes to meet its maker in a slaughterhouse. We don't need the government weighing in every time the price of cattle drops a little bit or the price of beef goes up. Let the market work. We were talking earlier about anti-competitive behavior. There have been 5 or 6, I'm losing track at this point, hearings, either in the House and the Senate side over the past year and a half, about looking at the cattle markets, the beef markets, the meat industry, etc. At one of those hearings, one of my members, who runs a sort of a small to medium-sized beef packing company, was a witness. And if I may, I'd like to quote him for my final words. And that is, and Francois grew up in France. He started his career in France, and then he moved to the United States. And he said, 30 years ago, I saw firsthand in France the result of direct government intervention in the meat industry. And it was a failure. I hope we avoid the same mistake here. And with that, I'll close.
Great, Mark. So Jennifer, what are your key takeaways and any solutions we may have missed?
Well, I think maybe just ending with where we started at the beginning. Practically every American is feeling and has felt the effects of inflation, with the biggest impact that they are seeing both at the fuel pump and on the food side, because it's so important to their families. And just as an industry, that we're doing everything we possibly can to try to avoid passing on increases and to try to control our costs. And we certainly see the impact that these increases are having on families. We're seeing our customers starting to have to trade down to find a less expensive product and sometimes a less expensive protein. And while we know this shows the economic stress that they're facing, we also know that each of us are able to offer the most economical solutions available to families during this time. So we're all in this together, and I think it's important for us to all stay in touch and really appreciate you putting this program together, because I do think it's very helpful.
Yeah, well, Jennifer, I want to thank you and Mark and Tom. Just thank you so much for joining us today. It's invaluable, really, to hear your expertise, and I think it's really important to kind of get a complete picture of what's going on, and I think we were able to do that. And of course, I want to thank all of you who are participating in today's program or watching a recording of the event. I encourage you to visit heritage.org to learn more about food prices and all the important work being done by the Heritage Foundation. Also, please visit heritage.org to learn more about future events. Again, thank you. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.